Hi everyone, good to see you. I think we can get started now. And hi everyone online, welcome to this seminar. It's great to see you joining. We've got people in the room as well. So welcome to this Resources, Environment and Development Department, or READ Department seminar as part of the Research Notes series. My name is Simon West and I'm a lecturer here with the READ Group. I'd like to open the seminar by acknowledging that we're hosting the seminar on the sovereign and unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also recognise in light of today's talk that all of the work that Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples are doing to care for biodiversity on these lands, and also recognise all the work of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across Australia as well. Today, we're very privileged and honoured to have with us Dr. Megan Evans, who will present to us on discourses and networks in biodiversity finance, who is driving for-profit conservation and why. This is a very timely topic, given the focus in the global architecture around biodiversity on ramping up biodiversity finance, and also at the national level as well with the upcoming nature repair market, which is a lot of work happening on that at the moment. So looking forward to discussing these issues. Megan's a senior lecturer in public sector management with the School of Business at the University of New South Wales here in Canberra, and chief investigator with the UNSW Institute for Climate Risk and Response. She's an interdisciplinary social scientist whose work aims to inform the design, implementation and evaluation of environmental laws, policies and tools. She recently completed an ARC DECRA award focusing on the effectiveness of impact investing for biodiversity conservation. And Megan also has a range of other roles as well, including on the editorial board of the journal Conservation Letters and other editorial roles as well. So the structure of this session is that Megan will present for about 35-40 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for about 20 minutes of discussion at the end. A couple of items before we get going. So we'll be recording Megan's seminar to make available on the Crawford School's YouTube channel, but we'll edit out the Q&A and discussion section at the end. And for those of you joining online, it'd be awesome if you could keep your mics on mute during Megan's presentation, and then we'll bring everyone into the discussion and Q&A at the end. So it'll be great to hear your questions and thoughts and reflections as well. So yeah, warm welcome, Megan. Thanks so much for coming in, and I hand over to you for your presentation.
Thank you so much. Is that okay in terms of volume? Perfect. Thank you. That was such a generous and kind introduction. I really appreciate the invitation. Also want to acknowledge that we're on unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and just acknowledge that that country has never been ceded. And yeah, I'm really thrilled to be back at the ANU. I did my PhD across the creek, Fenner. I know it's been a really challenging time for the ANU, so just want to extend my support and solidarity to all of you here today as well. I don't have COVID. I'm recovering from a chest infection. I have a nine-month-old daughter. I haven't stopped coughing for about 3 months. I've got asthma as well. So bear with me if I don't fully form my sentences today. And this is work that I have been, feels like I've been doing forever now. I started a DECRA in 2020. So I feel I'm honestly a little bit bored of it. I hope you're not. But you know, keen to share with you because I did try to get all this stuff submitted and published. I did get it submitted before I went on parental leave at the beginning of the year, but they both got rejected while I was on leave. So it's just been kind of a little bit disheartening, but we'll get there in the end. I want to start with definitions because I'm a bit of a nerd like that. I like to be on the same page about what we're actually talking about. So when we talk about biodiversity finance, this is a definition that I keep coming back to. It's from the OECD in 2020. And it's quite a broad definition. Financial flows where improving the state of biodiversity is a primary or a secondary objective or a co-benefit, and it can include public and private sources and the use of various financial instruments. Now, that's a rather broad definition, isn't it? It's like if you farted in the general direction of some biodiversity and finance, it could be called biodiversity finance, right? And if I'm not going to go into that kind of broadness of that definition, the implications thereof, but I really highly recommend this reference from Jens Christiansen. I'll produce a reference list that I can provide later. I forgot to do that, but they point out that, is, for example, investment in Lockheed Martin. Would that be considered biodiversity finance? According to some definitions, yeah, sure. So when we hear about the amount of finance that's being invested in biodiversity, be wary of definitions and what is counted as biodiversity finance. And I also refer to this as the latest neoliberal turn in biodiversity conservation. And I'll come back to that. But to take you back to 2022 or the end of 2021, where countries came together and came up with a new agreement under the Convention for Biological Diversity, which was the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Remember, this was interrupted by COVID. And one of the key parts of this text was this commitment to close this biodiversity finance gap of $700 billion per year. And that is defined as, the amount of money that is considered to be needed annually, or the gap between what is needed and what is currently invested in biodiversity. So in short, we need to come up with overall about 700 billion per year up to, I think, 2030, or maybe it's 2050, in order to effectively conserve biodiversity. And we hear this term biodiversity finance gap a lot. And I just want to step out some of the logic that we hear when we hear this narrative around biodiversity finance gap. So essentially then we've got this huge biodiversity finance gap. This was articulated, this is one of the early-ish reports from 2020 that coined this term. I don't think it was the first, but bear in mind this was 2020, and that terminology made it into the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework a couple of years later. And they found, their estimate was $824 billion US. So this is a large gap between what is currently spent and what is needed, and therefore, well, before we get to there, therefore, the other caveat is that, well, government can't possibly stump up that money because it just doesn't have the resources, right? And, we've got this narrative here. We can go back to 2022. This was at the beginnings of the nature repair market discussion in Australia. And this is one of the key narratives that the then Minister Plibersek was using to justify introducing this voluntary biodiversity market. Governments can't do the job alone. It could cost over $1 billion a year to save the environment. $1 billion a year in Australia to save our environment. Can we just touch grass a little bit here? This is over 10 years. I could probably put some other examples here, but just a few little examples of other stuff that the government spends public money on. But saving Australia's threatened biodiversity, which, around $2 billion a year, 1 or 2, I don't know, 3, who cares? It's nothing, it doesn't come anywhere close to the amount of money, public money, that is spent on fossil fuels at worsening climate change, on submarines that we'll never get, on making the rich richer, etc. So, some perspective. But, put that reality or facts aside for the moment. Government's too poor, I know. What do we need to do? We need to leverage, we need to unlock, we need to catalyze, we need to harness, we need to mobilize private finance to fill that gap, because all of the money in the world, most of it is held by private hands. Therefore, we should just, tickle some of that out of them, because, that's much easier apparently, than trying to get some public money. Coming back to this latest neoliberal turn, this is not a new narrative. And we've got Sarah Milne in the audience, and I would be remiss to not mention her work on corporate nature and her long-standing work in this space. This work on neoliberal conservation as the term is discussed in the literature, the idea that we need to make conservation profitable, that we need to make it investable, bring in private finance. This has been around for about 30 years at least, or at least there's been scholarship on it for at least 30 years. It's taken various forms, but the general gist of it is that most money is in private hands. Therefore, in order to get that money, nature conservation has to become bankable, pay for itself. All of this jargonistic terms that essentially means it needs to make a profit. Attracting private finance means that biodiversity conservation has to return commercially acceptable investor returns, 8, 9, 10, 15% per annum per year. Okay, this is what those words mean. And as Fletcher and Boucher point that out, this is essentially asking capitalism to solve the problem created by capitalism in the first place. Okay, tied to the very forces and logics that degrade and destroyed nature in the first place. And I can already hear some of the, whispers or complaints potentially from critics who might not agree with me. Well, that's very ideological of you, Megan. You've got to be practical, you've got to be solutions focused, etc. We'll come to that. The evidence is that over 30 years, we have consistently never seen an example of neoliberal conservation working at the scale that is needed. It has only ever delivered slithers of finance to biodiversity conservation. And as Jess Dempsey has highlighted before, is that there's always this hope or fantasy that big money is just around the next corner. It's this temporal, what does she call it? This temporal kind of discourse where, in the next 5 years, this is going to be big money. 5 years later, in the next 5 years, this is going to be big money. And it just goes and it goes on and on and on and continues to fail forward, as Robert Fletcher has highlighted. I've highlighted here that, it's not a new story, but it appears to be a more pervasive discourse than ever. So why do I say that? How do I justify that? Back in 2020, 2021, when I was just starting on this DECRA, there was just report after report after report coming out every week, it seemed, on biodiversity finance. And I was sitting there thinking, what on earth is going on? And I had a very unscientific research question. It was vaguely, basically, what the heck is going on with these reports? So I decided to study them. And this has been a long-term piece of work with some brilliant colleagues where we did a semi-systematic review of these reports, and we had to develop a method from scratch. Because when you do a systematic review of the academic literature, there's a whole bunch of tools that you can just go to Web of Science, plug it in and export and, use bibliometrics beautifully. You can't do that with grey literature because there's no standardized database. They don't have, references or citations attached to them. It's actually difficult to know who has published them sometimes. If someone has a logo on a report, are they an author? Are they a publisher? Are they a contributor? Are they there just to make it look good? We had to kind of develop this method from the ground up, data-driven and collaboratively. I don't know, this is before AI went crazy. Someone might turn around and say, oh, you could just get an AI to do it. I don't, maybe it could help in the future, but we really had to use our human brains to do some of this, or to do all of this work. And my hunch was right. We did this systematic approach to sample or to collect as many of these reports we could find. And we found just over 200 reports in our final sample. And if you look at the graph, a couple of years ago, Cosma et al., they actually did a systematic review of the academic literature on conservation finance, which is pretty much the same thing. And that's the black line. If you compare that to the reports that we identified in biodiversity finance, there's just been an explosion since 2020. So, and 60% of our sample was published between 2020 and 2022. So, this suggests that a lot of people were trying to get their reports out prior to the Kunming-Montreal conference. My understanding is that seems to be common before COPs, is that you get as many reports out there to kind of shape the narrative. But this is, kind of a useful illustration of the volume of stuff that was out there. What do the reports say? Now, there's a whole range of ways that you could analyse these reports. We, because there's only 200, and when you do bibliometrics on, and culturonomics in the academic literature, there's usually thousands and thousands of articles and millions of words. It wasn't really a huge sample. We just did a very kind of fairly basic text analysis looking at n-grams. So a 1 gram is a single word, a 2 gram is a 2 word. So biodiversity is a 1 gram, biodiversity finance is a 2 gram, nature-based solution is a 3 gram, for example. So, and the key search terms are biodiversity, nature, and finance. So if you look at here, there's some general terms. Over time, for example, on the left, biodiversity conservation as a term has actually gone down in these reports, which I found interesting. Mainstreaming biodiversity, they got excited in the 2010s and then we forgot about it. In terms of finance terms, financial disclosure, you can see that pop out. We've only been talking about that biodiversity for the last, less than 5 years, as you can see. This is fairly descriptive, but you can kind of corroborate a lot of the kind of general things that we hear. All of these various terms around finance, biodiversity finance, sustainable finance, climate finance, up and down, right? This was the interesting stuff. So the term nature has really only just started to explode in the last less than 5 years. Nature-related financial disclosures, nature positive, nature loss, nature-based solutions. Nature conservancy has been there forever, obviously. Task force nature, depth of nature swaps. Yep, they've been around for a long time, at least it's the start of our sample, 2000. Makes you wonder whether depth of nature swaps are really an innovative instrument when they've been around for so long. New nature I found weird, but when I talk about my research later on, where I actually did interviews with biodiversity finance professionals, nearly every single one of them, bearing in mind that I did these interviews in 2022, nearly every single one of them mentioned this report, this World Economic Forum, Nature Risk Rising, New Nature Economy series. New nature comes up quite clearly as a frequent term in these reports, presumably because they're saying, the New Nature Economy report talked about biodiversity loss being one of the biggest threats to blah. That was the narrative at the time. Why am I looking at this? Why am I looking at these terms? How these problems, or any problem, but particularly biodiversity conservation as a problem, how problems are framed by whom shapes the proposed solutions. So if we frame biodiversity conservation as a problem of finance, then naturally the solutions are going to be financial. Okay. These discourses and interactions between various actors ultimately shape how we govern the world, and what we discuss and how shapes what is possible. So again, this is from 2022, when Minister Plibiscite announced the Green Wall Street, which got a lot of pushback at the time. This was going to be, Australia is going to be the Green Wall Street for the world to come and invest in nature. And for anyone who's keeping track on how that's going, You might get a little giggle out of it, but it's still just, I'm going to come back to that. Now, if we think about this gap discourse, there are critics of it, particularly just Dempsey and others have done a lot of great work on it. They kind of point out that when you talk about this biodiversity finance gap, it actually highlights or focuses attention on closing that gap, which, you know, almost naturally, based on the narrative, needs to be filled by private finance because, you know, remember, governments are help me, I'm poor. And then history and evidence shows that we barely get any finance from the private sector based on, you know, what we've seen on market-based instruments in historically. And that narrative and that discussion, effectively, whether it's on purpose or not, when we're only talking about private finance, we don't talk about subsidy reform. We don't talk about debt justice. We don't talk about the need to increase domestic budgets. These things, you know, funding, not finance. Most conservation can't turn a profit, okay? There are the number of times I've heard, how do we make biodiversity profitable? It's, you know, there's people going to be asking that question in 50 years, I reckon. Most of it it's not possible to turn a profit, okay? I can talk about, I've got a bonus slide at the end that I can justify that a bit, but the vast majority of conservation can't generate, you know, investor grade commercial returns. So therefore it's not going to attract private finance. Therefore we're always going to need, you know, more funding that comes from public sources. And most of that, you know, a big potential source of that is from subsidy reform, for example. But, you know, we rarely talk about that. To highlight that point, Target 18, under the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, remember the gap, the finance gap was 700 bill. They indicate in this, or in the framework, at least 500 billion per year needs to come from subsidy reform. Okay. And then Target 19 then talks about finding new money to the remaining 200, which has to come from a whole bunch of other things. You know, I've highlighted some of the, you know, things that people like to focus on, like leveraging finance, green bonds, biodiversity offsets, credits, which are innovative apparently, domestic resource mobilisation, national budgets. So 500 has been, you know, earmarked in this global agreement as from subsidy reform, and the remaining from everything else. Now, this graph, I'll take a moment to explain it. This report, which I mentioned before, came out in 2020, and it's from a Nature Conservancy thing, Paulson Institute. I don't think it's an especially, you know, groundbreaking report or particularly great report. I kind of regard it as an industry report, and so therefore I would consider potentially some or all of their estimates to be overestimates of how much finance you might get from various financial instruments. But I like it because it actually spells out, it's actually done an estimate of how much finance could be possible to achieve from for biodiversity from, you know, a range of different financial instruments. And it's come up with estimates of how much of that biodiversity finance gap could possibly come from, you know, official development assistance, harmful subsidies or removal of biodiversity offsets, green financial products like green bonds, nature-based solutions, yada, yada, yada. I'm going to get you to focus on I won't step away from that, the middle graph. So it's pretty much all pink, right? So most of the biodiversity finance gap, according to the Paulson Institute, they think from for the 2019 estimate, that comes from harmful subsidy reform. Bearing in mind that their estimate completely excludes fossil fuel subsidies. So this is only agricultural subsidies, okay? Their 2030 estimate is a bit different. Again, bear in mind that by 2030, they assume that all major harmful subsidies have been removed based on an OECD recommendation. So that's why the proportion of the gap that could be filled by 2030 by harmful subsidy removal is a lot less, because they've assumed most of them are gone by 2030. Okay. So from here, based on their estimate, most of this gap they think can be filled by harmful subsidy reform and domestic budgets. Is that everyone okay with that? Now, when we did a text analysis of our 200 or so reports for these terms and calculated how frequently each of these financial instruments were mentioned in these reports, we found a very different picture. The vast majority of the well, this isn't referring explicitly to a gap, but we're going to talk about the frequency at which these different instruments were mentioned in the reports. Nature-based solutions and carbon markets were the most frequently mentioned. Next was green financial products. That includes, it's primarily green bonds, biodiversity offsets, and subsidies were rarely mentioned. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that while nature-based solutions and carbon markets seem to be discussed a lot more proportionally in these reports than their relative, estimated contribution to filling this biodiversity finance gap. I think that's interesting. This is a quant study, so we can't really get to a why kind of question, but I still think it's a useful illustration of a bit of a mismatch between what we talk about and an estimate, or perhaps something closer to reality of what can actually be achieved. And it is interesting when there is a difference between discourse and reality, or perhaps hope and estimation. Who publishes these reports? This was a really fun part of the analysis. And again, it was a lot of manual-based work. We had to manually extract, well, there were over 329 organisations who contributed to these reports over a 22-year period. And we looked at what these networks look like over time. So, from 2020 to 2022, the network is so much bigger than what it was in the earlier years. The vast majority of organisations contributing to these reports were governments or NGOs. More than half of these 329 organisations had only published in the last 2 years. So, over time, we've certainly seen a large increase in the number and even the diversity of different actors who are contributing to these biodiversity finance reports. But the top 5 most prolific contributors, and I use the word contributor deliberately because we weren't able to evaluate whether they were an author, whether they were a funder, whether they were a publisher. Additional work would need to be done to make that judgment, and we chose to just not make a judgment about the nature of their contribution. UNDP, WWF, OECD, World Economic Forum, GEF. These were the top 5 most prolific contributors to reports. These are, well-known organisations involved in environmental governance. They're all talking about biodiversity finance. Where's the finance sector? They were very much on the periphery of this network. There were a few. We did colour code them. A lot of them were kind of around here, not necessarily connected to others. And by connections, there were those who co-authored stuff together. Sometimes they would be off in little shoots like here, like there'd be a bunch of banks who would come up with a report, but not actually publish or co-author with an environmental NGO, for example. But in terms of centrality, bridging ties, all of those kind of classic network estimates, These were the big organisations. It's not the finance sector. So these reports, and this is the full network, by the way, over 2000 to 2022. The reports are primarily being published by the UN, governments and NGOs, not the finance sector. And you might, I don't know, maybe you'll be surprised or not surprised, but this is a pattern that is consistent with what we've seen in international development and in climate finance, whereby development and climate are being positioned as investable. We need private investment from the private sector to deliver climate finance, to deliver development finance. This is what Daniela Gabor has articulated in her Wall Street consensus, where the private sector needs to step in, but government is going to guarantee their investments, right? And what do I mean by that? It means, and it's similar term to de-risking, what she calls the de-risking state. So they'll say, we really want to attract private finance into, I don't know, this carbon project. We will de-risk that. And what that means is that they want the private sector to come in and invest. But if that project doesn't make the amount of money or make money along the private expectations, government's going to foot the bill. Okay, that's what de-risking means. It means using public money to guarantee the private sector will actually make money. Why don't we just use that money to fund it rather than, you know what I mean? It's yeah. So, and as we already also know, development and climate finance, also grossly underfunded by governments. WWF is an interesting case. So there's an amazing study, this one here, where they did a really detailed case study of, I think, WWF Netherlands, and where they, over years and years and years, they looked at all of their reports and all of their trainings and all of their internal documentation around WWF and showed how it had become financialized over time. There was training on, how to use financial language, etc. And what they found was that they didn't actually generate more private finance. They didn't actually attract more private finance to WWF. They got more public finance, but they didn't get more private money. But the use of the financialized language helped them gain legitimacy to access more public money. So this points to an interesting thought that this isn't actually about unlocking private finance. Maybe that's some of the intention. Maybe, I'm not suggesting that this is a grand conspiracy, but there are other strategic goals that can be fulfilled by using financialized language and by discussing endlessly the potential for private finance to solve various societal goals. I'm wary I've spoken for half an hour. I'm just going to take a sip of water. And so Hang Bui, who did all of the network analysis, she actually has this brilliant app where you can go and explore the networks that we generated. I just want to briefly touch on some of the other work that I did, where we actually did some qualitative work interviewing biodiversity finance professionals. We use discourse analysis to analyse these discourses. So I'm just going to focus on one of those. One of the key ones, well, the primary discourse really. So we had two primary discourses around innovation and regulation. And the top one was the object of innovation, which is tradable biodiversity units, biodiversity credits, biodiversity offsets, whatever you want to call them. And participants viewed this commodification that was necessary to get to a biodiversity unit as simultaneously impossible, but inevitable. So there was this real ambivalence or simultaneously conflicting thoughts around well, everyone wants this unit, but it's very difficult to do. Biodiversity isn't fungible except when it's a credit. And I'm not trying to shame this person at all, but this is a brilliant illustration of this theme. It's notable this person is the head of biodiversity finance at UNEP FI. Purchased a biodiversity credit or some biodiversity credits, but doesn't believe in commodification. It is an interesting illustration of this phenomenon. The other thing was that it wasn't always clear who was going to buy these credits or why. They were very important, but no one could really tell me who would buy them or why. So we got, quotes like, potential buyers haven't clarified their own drivers, which, if you remove some of the BS, that translation is no one wants to buy them yet, which is basically what's still happening, okay? Other interviewees, were more confident, and this is a very long-winded quote that says, some buyers want to invest and generate a return, others want to not offset impact, but rather compensate for the impact. And so using some kind of language gymnastics to say, all right, well, they either want to make money out of them or they want to use them as dodgy offsets. Because offsetting, it's not actually offsetting if you're using a generic credit to offset orange-bellied parrot, for example. That's not an offset, that's just dodgy. What are the material consequences of this discourse? What does all of that mean? Great, Megan, you're just talking about what people are talking about. What are the consequences? Well, they're actually quite real. When we talk about scaling biodiversity markets, the only reason really why people would want to buy a biodiversity credit is to compensate for a loss. Losses are biodiversity loss. Biodiversity markets are predicated on death, okay? And I credit my colleague Kirsty Amantharaja for highlighting this to me and bringing in the necropolitics as a theoretical frame to think about this. And the consequences are most acutely felt for our most threatened species. So you can't restore in a reasonable time frame orange-bellied parrot habitat, and you can't compensate it by growing some mallee in central Queensland. But that is what using a generic credit means and offsetting it for a loss. To really bring it home, just yesterday, Australian nature repair markets to be used for offsetting purposes under our new environmental law reforms. For anyone who's been had the displeasure of paying attention to nature positive law reforms over the last God knows how many years, the previous Labor government spent 2 years trying to get through their nature repair market. And one of the main stumbling blocks was people were opposed to the use of nature repair market credits for offsetting purposes. They've just snuck it back in, hoping people won't notice, just as they dropped the bills last week. This was a big thing, they only got the legislation passed when Greens, made this deal to exclude their use as offsets. They've just slipped them back in, they don't care. Now, we know that really no one really wants to buy these things voluntarily. So making it mandatory solves that problem. Isn't that wonderful? And, people will say that. It's a nice example of how a lot of these markets actually rely more and more on government intervention, which is this paradox or neoliberal paradox that's been highlighted. So, to answer my original question, who's driving for-profit conservation and why? We've got a bit of a partial answer here, at least. I'm sure there's a whole range of different answers, and whether it was deliberate or not, who knows? I don't think a lot of it is deliberate. But you can see how we're going to have this amazing market. So let's get excited. We'll distract from the fact that we're, not funding enough. We're too poor to fund conservation. oh, market's not really working, no one's really buying it, oh, we'll just use it as a compulsory compliance issue. That's actually going to make things worse. So that's a depressing conclusion. I did have some bonus slides, but we probably don't have time. But I just want to, yeah, look, there's a lot of work, I think a lot of valuable work in examining these discourses, and you know, there's been decades of this work. A lot of them are still the same as they were 30 years ago. I'm interested in how can they be disrupted? How can discourses be challenged or shaped or changed? I don't have the answer to that, but that's, I guess, the next step. Thank you.